So, good evening from Germany, and good day, good morning, good night to every country in the world. I'm happy you are here again and happy we have that opportunity for a new lecture to listen today. Today, actually, when I opened my Google account, it says I didn't know before, it says it's World Teachers' Day. So it's our day, we can celebrate ourselves today. All the best for you and good work. And maybe you did some kind of celebration at your place. I don't know. We didn't do it in Alanus, but we should have done maybe. So we do it this evening together with Peter. So I'm very happy to welcome Professor Peter Lutzker. He is from Freie Hochschule Stuttgart. For many years now, he's professor there. He's originally from the US, from New York, and he studied music and literature in the US. And then he has been a musician and with an orchestra playing the French horn for a couple of years. And then he came to Germany. I don't know what brought you to Germany. Maybe you can tell that story too, like Ida. And he did a Waldorf teacher training at the Waldorf Teacher Training Center in Witten-Annen. And then he has been a Waldorf teacher for more than, I think, 10, 20 years, something like that, in Frankfurt and in Düsseldorf, a high school teacher for English and for music. And now for 10 years, he is in Stuttgart as a professor, and he's mainly responsible for a wonderful master program, international master program at Freie Hochschule Stuttgart. And he did a dissertation, he wrote a dissertation about the sense of language, Sprachsinn, which has been published in English and in German. And so this has been his academic writing, and he published a lot of articles and given lectures all over the world. And so we are quite happy to have you here with us today, Peter, and it's yours now to give us a talk.
So thank you for the introduction, Joost, and good day and happy World Teachers' Day to everyone. And I'd also like to thank Laura and Katharina for all the support that they've given us to have this series, and Joost in particular also for the idea, which has been a great idea. I'd like to start this evening with looking at two questions that I think lie at the heart of Waldorf education. And the first question is, I think that we're always asking ourselves, what is appropriate at a certain age for a child's development? That we're always, that the idea of age appropriate is something I think that deeply a part of Waldorf education. What does a child need to experience at a certain age? What would be healthy for them to experience, to learn, and what is the right point in time for that to happen? And the thought behind that is that there are certain periods in life when certain kinds of experience, certain kinds of learning are most appropriate, fit most to that age. And at the same time, I think we know that most mainstream education in the world, as far as I'm familiar with it, doesn't put that question in that way. The question that they're asking is more, when are children capable of learning something? At what point are children capable of learning something new? And the thought behind that is generally the sooner the better. And if we look at education throughout the world, as far as I'm familiar with it, this idea of the sooner the better is something that's become deeply a part of educational thinking in many, many countries. And that's why you'll have, in many countries, for instance, introducing writing and reading already in kindergarten age. You'll have children in first grade working with tablets or laptops. And the idea is the children are capable of doing that, and many children are. The thought that we have is that maybe they're capable of that, or maybe many of them are capable of that, but is that the most important thing for them to be doing at that particular age? And neurologists and psychologists are asking the same question. And if you look at research in the last 10, 15, 20 years, there's been increasing research from neurologists and psychologists saying this idea of the sooner the better is very problematic. That what, for instance, children in kindergarten age need to do is not to be learning to read and write, but they need to be developing their sensory skills, their motor skills, their social skills, and teaching them consciously to learn at that point, rather than letting them just play and be with their peers and exercise their creativity and their imagination, it's the wrong time. So it's not only Waldorf that's asking this question, it's also, in the meantime, people particularly from the medical therapeutic fields, who are looking at brain development, we're looking at social development, and saying the sooner the better is basically, from a neurological standpoint, untenable. It doesn't hold up. And what neurologists and psychologists and Waldorf education, I think, all have in common is that we're looking at a larger picture. We're not looking at that moment, when are they capable of learning to read, when are they capable of learning to write, when are they capable of working with numbers, but they're looking at the question, what does it mean for their later development to begin something early or later? And this biographical question is something that I think is very much at the heart of Waldorf education. When we do something, what will it mean for their later lives? What can we teach in such a way at what point in time that in their later lives, both in school and then after school and as adults, that this leads to the possibilities of healthy development, leads to the possibilities of being able to lead a meaningful, purposeful life. It leads to the possibilities of being able to engage with the world. And if the senses and motor skills have not been developed at certain critical periods, this becomes much, much more difficult. So I think we do have this larger picture. And I think that's the other question that we're asking ourselves that I think distinguishes Waldorf education, that this idea, what happens later in life, is extremely important to all our considerations of how we're teaching and what we're teaching. So this brings me to the second question, which I'm looking at from a biographical perspective. And I would like to phrase it like this. What are the later consequences of what happens in school for our pupils' lives? How can what we teach now contribute to the way our pupils are later able to lead their lives, and to lead their lives in a purposeful way, in a way in which they can find meaning and joy, and engage with the world? That is an individual question on one hand. That is, each child, in some ways needs something different. And our task as teachers, and the art of teaching, is to try to be able to find ways to help each individual child with realizing their intentions and their potentials in life. It's also a societal perspective. It's also a question of looking ahead 10, 20, 30 years when our children will be growing up in society, and trying to imagine the world they'll be living in, and what will they need in that context to lead purposeful lives, lead meaningful lives. And this was an idea that Rudolf Steiner very strongly emphasized when they founded the Waldorf School in 1919. He said teachers really had to be thinking the whole time, what was going to be life going to be like in 10 years and 20 years? This is part of the way they have to teach, is to have that in their consciousness and to try to figure out. He says day and night, teachers should be trying to figure out what life is going to demand of pupils later in their lives. And he also said, and I think that's interesting, that he said the test of Waldorf schools would not be in the time of school. The test of Waldorf schools would be what happened later in people's lives. So I'd like to introduce right at the beginning this biographical perspective, that when we talk about the role of the senses this evening, what it means in the course of a later life. Joost mentioned last week this idea of living concepts. And that's also, I think, very much a part of this perspective, that when we teach something, we try to teach it in such a way that 10, 20, 30 years later, it's not remembered in exactly the way it was taught, but it's transformed, it's become metamorphized, it's become something different than what it was. That when we teach the history of our cultures, whether it's in Europe, it's Greek and Roman cultures, in the world, rest of the world, I'm sure it's different cultures, that 20 years later, they're not saying the same things, they're not remembering the same things that we talked about then, when they're in 5th grade or 6th grade, but it's taken on new form. It's become part of them. It's transferred. The pictures that they've had, the concepts they have are living concepts. And trying to contrast that with dead concepts, with fixed concepts. And he says it would be like, an adult would have to wear a child's shoes, have to wear the shoes that he or she was wearing as a child, if the concepts stay the same and don't grow with the child. So I think, Joost brought this up last week, particularly in terms of the high school age. And this is certainly true of all ages, that this idea that what we're teaching we're thinking at the same time, how does this metamorphose? Does this metamorphose? Is it transformable into something meaningful in a different way later in life? And in a certain sense, it's not about remembering at all. And I discovered a quotation not that long ago from a lecture by Steiner that I found extremely interesting as to what happens with everything that we learn and then forget. And this was at a lecture in Berlin well before the founding of the Waldorf School. And as with all the quotations that I'll read, at the end, Laura, I will download sources and the quotations, so you'll be able to find them. Okay, thank you for telling me that it's not loud enough. I will gladly speak louder. Thank you. So I'd like to read to you what Steiner said in this lecture in Berlin. It was 1912. And because I think it's very relevant to this perspective of what stays with us later in our lives. He says, for example, a human being has learned ballads or other poetries of great heroes with particular tasks, particular qualities at a certain age. He may forget the thoughts, the events, etc., so that he cannot reproduce them again. However, it remains what he has learned in the structure of his own character, maybe as a soul force, as a way to face life and to approach joy and sorrow to himself. What we forget changes into moods, feelings, will impulses, so that what does not rest more or less consciously in our soul life, but creates, however, and forms in us. Thus we realize positively how that what we forget, what disappears from our memory, works on our soul and appears then in our mood as joy and sorrow, as courage or bravery or cowardice, or also as fear and fear of life. What we see sinking from the treasure of memory into subconsciousness becomes creative in our soul. We are what the things that we have forgotten have made of us. So when we teach with that consciousness, that what we're doing, the idea is not that it stays in its form. It becomes a part of the children or the young people, becomes transformed and becomes part of their way of living, their way of life. That it becomes part of who they are. And this offers us a very different perspective on what we're trying to do and why we're doing it. And if we look, that's the individual perspective, what we're giving to the pupils as their teachers. I'd like to look now at the societal perspective, because the societal perspective, as I said, is equally important. What kind of life will they be leading 20, 30 years from now? What will society look like? And of course, in our different cultures, there's going to be differences. But I think one of the effects of globalization is that the similarities in some ways have come to outweigh the differences. And if we think about the beginnings of Waldorf education, 1919, just how unbelievably different the world is today. And in fact, if we think about just the 21st century, if you think about what's happened since the beginning of the 21st century, the changes in those 20 years have been enormous. In the United States and in Germany and in other countries I've been to, one talks now about the I generation, the generation that grew up with iPhones as part of their life, that don't really, as young people, know a world other than a world with internet and a world with iPhones. And that's children, young people who were born after 1995, grew up in a world that is a new generation that is growing up in a situation that's completely different than the generations before. And the fact that all that comes to mean, whether it's social media, whether it's the use of internet, whether it's all the different wonderful possibilities we have in many ways, that's the only life they know. And so in a certain sense, these transitions, the difference between 2000 and 2021 is already enormous. And I think it's quite clear that difference is going to grow even more so in the next 20, 30 years. And this will mostly be through artificial intelligence, which is already changing many things. And we can be certain in the next 20, 30 years, the possibility of artificial intelligence will radically transform the world. I can see that in my field of foreign language teaching. I can see that when I teach courses, for instance, in Taiwan, the language teachers say their kids are walking in with instant translators, where they speak into Chinese into the little gadget and then it comes out English. And they're saying, why should they learn English? And, and I experience this with colleagues who, they're in the meantime, there are translation programs that if you put an entire text into the internet, and it comes out, you put it in one language, it comes out in another language. That used to be very badly done. It used to actually be pretty funny, what came out. In the meantime, it's not funny. It's actually very good. The last pedagogical section newsletter, articles were translated not by people anymore, but by people, which is a very effective program. So we can see how everything, this is just the beginning of that. So, I think we have to be very aware of that. And I heard or actually read an article by Klaus Schwab recently. Klaus Schwab is one of the world's leading economists, who's the person responsible for the Davos conference every year in Switzerland, where the most important politicians and leaders of companies, the most important figures in the world economy and in the world politics come together. Klaus Schwab said something very interesting. I'd just like to read what he says. He said that the fourth industrial revolution, which is what he's calling the age of artificial intelligence, finally will change not only what we do, but also who we are. And he has a long list of the ways it's going to change who we are and the way we live our lives. And then he says, at the end, he says, the only limitations to this list are the limitations of his imagination. And I think there's things we need to think about. And I realize that our everyday life often doesn't allow us the possibilities to think about this or to talk about it with our colleagues. But this is, I think, part of the ideals of Waldorf education, are that we try to take this into account and think about what can we do to prepare children for that kind of life. And Klaus Schwab doesn't mention the senses, and I don't think he's thought of that. I think it goes beyond his imagination. I would like to talk about the senses, because I think these radical transformations in society call for a different understanding of the role of the senses. I mean, our senses are the way we take in the world. We take in our world, take in the world through seeing, through hearing, through smelling, through touching. It's the way the world enters into us. And the whole organization of the senses is a unified organization. They're all connected. You are hearing me, I hope now, louder, and you're seeing me. Those are, in the senses, two completely different pathways, go to completely different parts of the brain. The sensory systems for hearing and seeing are totally different, yet you see both coming together, as one. And that is what the sensory organization is all about, that all our different sensory impressions come together as unified impressions. And we also have senses that don't take the world into us. We have senses that enable us to take part in the world through our bodies. There's a number of senses that are involved in our being able to stay in balance, our sense of balance, to be able to move, our sense of proprioception, which enables us to move without having to think about, how do I move my hand now? Our senses give us the responses we need. So when you're going to pick up something, I pick up my watch here, I don't have to think about how much tension I need in my hand, because my hand unconsciously will do that. And that has to do with the sense of proprioception. And sensory, the senses in that sense is not, you can't really divide it into sensory perception and motor abilities and what we do, because they're completely connected. You can't have one without the other. And this becomes particularly clear in those cases where, for instance, the sense of proprioception, which enables us to move without thinking about it, when that is destroyed, when that no longer functions, and there is unfortunately the receptors for that sense, then the effects of that are profound. People can still move, but they have to think about every single move they make consciously. Every move that you make without thinking about it, they have to think about to be able to make that movement, because there's no sense letting them unconsciously make that movement by its own. That's part of what you lose when you lose the sense of proprioception. And the other part is even more profound. They lose the feeling that they are the person moving. And so their whole feeling of being a person, being the self that moves, is lost. You know, one of the patients who had this sickness says, undoubtedly I think, but I do not exist. And so we can see that even senses we often don't even know we have, like proprioception, are senses that are profound, have a profound effect on what we do and how we do it. And when those senses no longer function, it has profound effects, not only on, in this sense, the sense of movement, but also profound effects on our feeling of who we are and who it is who makes those movements. It's interesting that yesterday, the Nobel Prize was won by people, two people, and one of them did a fantastic research on this sense. Okay, and you know, actually both Nobel Prizes had to do with a study of the senses, great discoveries made about how the senses work. There's so much we don't understand, and these two scientists got the Nobel Prize for discovering things that nobody had understood up to then. And one of them really studied, his breakthrough was to understand, you know, this sensory molecular level of proprioception. So if the senses are that important, you know, so important that when we lose a sense, for instance, like proprioception, that we lose our sense of identity. And if we think about that, we take in the world through the quality of our senses, and the quality of our sensory perception will determine, you know, Yost talked last week about feelings. Feelings are shaped by the way we perceive the world. The feelings are shaped by how the world enters into us. And so the quality of our sensory perception will in very many ways affect how we feel what we do. And, you know, we're born, if we're fortunate, with all our senses intact. But, you know, it's a gift that we have. But they're all capable of development. And when I look at the future and try to understand what young people are going to need later in their lives, one of the things that comes up again and again for me is they're going to need to have really developed their senses in such a way that they can notice the difference between an artificial virtual world and the real world. That they can, and all their different senses, and we'll talk more concretely about this, have developed their senses to the point that they take in the world in all its richness with their senses, and thus realize the difference when they're in a virtual world. I mean, if you look at, and you can go through any sense and see how possible it would be to develop it. You know, if you look at sense of vision, you know, our primary dominant sense, think about the sense, you know, vision of a painter, you know, how much they see, how much more they've learned to see through practice than most of us have. You know, and if you look, for instance, at the great French painter Cézanne and what he wrote in his letters, he's always talking about how he's trying to see more clearly. And, you know, he paints the same picture, the same mountain, he painted it like 70 times, because he says he's always trying to get it right. He's always trying to get what's there, what he's seeing, and he's not sure he's seeing enough. He's not sure he's seeing it clearly. He's not sure he's seeing this light as opposed to the light that was 10 minutes earlier. So we're capable of developing our senses, and there are people who, just because of that's what they do, have really developed the senses to a point that they have a very different way of seeing the world. Musicians, you know, you know, for a musician to hear the difference between a tone tone A that's vibrating at 440 hertz per second, and the same tone A that's vibrating at 441 hertz per second, that's a huge difference. You know, a musician will recoil when that difference of that one vibration is there, because they've learned to hear that difference, and that difference is part of the way they listen to the world, they listen to music. So you can go through really all the senses and find people who've developed them to really say, wow, that's possible. You know, I had a good friend who was a wine sommelier, and to drink a glass of wine with him, it was a huge pleasure, because it was a mystery. You know, he would drink his glass of wine and start talking about all these different things he tasted, and I would drink the same glass of wine and didn't taste any of that. And you know, it was sort of And he'd talk about the way these grapes, had been grown, and the amount of sun they had, and the different tastes that came about for that. And I realized how rich his experience was of something that I was not experiencing in any comparable way. And then, there's one test, the sense of taste of a cook, the sense of smell of a cook, So I think it's really important to realize how important these senses are and what it would mean to develop them in terms of the way we encounter the world. And I think looking into the future, looking into a world that's going to be so dominated by virtual reality, by artificial intelligence, being able to distinguish between the real world and the virtual world will be a question of how developed the senses are. And when people lose their senses, they often then compensate by developing other senses to a high degree. And one of there's lots of examples I could give you, but I'd like to give you one example that has always meant a lot to me. That's the example of, some of you will know his books, Jacques Bisseron. He's a Frenchman who was in the Second World War, was one of the leaders of the French resistance against the Nazis, and later became a professor for literature. And Jacques Bisseron was blinded in an accident at the age of 10. And when he writes about that in his autobiography, he wrote about it also in a book called Blindness, A New Way of Seeing. He says this was a great gift. He describes this as a great gift because he said he learned to understand and perceive the world in ways that he had never dreamed possible. And he talks about the sense of sight as a blind person. And he says it's a very practical sense, but a very superficial sense. And when he compares the way he experiences the world now with the way he experienced, or the way he experienced the world after he was blind, with the way he experienced it before, he says it got much, much richer because his perception was no longer superficial, which is what he says is the danger with the sense of sight. And I'd just like to read you an excerpt of what he wrote when he describes what happens when he walks into a room. After I went blind, I could never make a motion without starting an avalanche of noise. I went into my room at night, the room where I used to hear nothing. The small plaster statue on the mantelpiece made a fraction of a turn. I heard its friction in the air, as light a sound as the sound of a waving hand. Whenever I took a step, the floor cried or sang. I could hear it making both these sounds, and its song was passed along from one board to the next, all the way to the window to give me the measure of the room. If I spoke out suddenly, the window panes, which seemed so solid in their putty frames, began to shake, very lightly, of course, but distinctly. This noise was on a higher pitch than the others, cooler, as if it were already in contact with the outside air. Every piece of furniture creaked once, twice, 10 times, and made a trail of sounds like gestures as minutes passed. The bed, the wardrobe, the chairs were stretching, yawning, and catching their breath. Sounds had the same individuality as light. They were neither inside nor outside. They were passing through me. They gave me my bearings in space and put me in touch with things. It was not like signals that they functioned, but like replies. So, and if you read his autobiography and you realize how highly developed his sense of hearing was and what that enabled him to do. And for Rudolf Steiner, who spent years and years studying the senses, it was one of his primary areas of study, of research, was the study of the senses. He grouped the sense of hearing, what he called the social senses, those senses that connect us to others, to other people. And it's maybe then not surprising that Bisseron in the Second World War, as the leader, the student leader of the student resistance, had the task in that at that time to decide who could be trusted, who could be allowed into the resistance and who couldn't be trusted. And people would come and he describes how these interviews work. People would come in the room, see he was blind, relax, and they would talk. And he just describes how he perceived these people. And it became very clear he's perceiving far more than they could even imagine. They think he can't see them, but he's perceiving them far more than if he just saw them. And when I talk about Rudolf Steiner's idea of social senses, they go past the sense of hearing. And I know many of you will be familiar with this, but many won't. And Rudolf Steiner extended the senses to include a sense for language, that the reason we can understand language is not because we think about or have to think about what do those words mean, but because we directly understand those words if we speak that language. So there's a sense for language, there's a sense for thought, that we can understand the thoughts of somebody, not because we need to analyze, well, what do those words add up to and what thought is it? We understand directly, just as a sense. We understand a smell, we perceive a smell directly. We perceive something, we have direct impression, so we can also capable of directly understanding a thought. And the last of the social senses was the sense of self, not the sense of oneself, but the sense that enables us to perceive the self of another. And these senses, what you call social senses or higher senses, are senses that are obviously for us as teachers, extremely important senses. And I think one of our tasks as teachers will be to work on those senses to a degree that we can help our pupils also develop those same senses. Because, this idea in Waldorf education, which I think is one of the great innovations of Waldorf education, is the idea that the teacher educating him or herself creates the basis for which the pupils can educate themselves. In other words, the self-education, the self-development of the teacher creates the space, the environment that pupils can self-educate and self-develop themselves as well. So when we look at trying to develop those senses in ourselves first, it becomes clear that I think all the great educators of the world have been speaking about this. Rudolf Steiner spoke about it, but I think all great educators have in common, they talk about how can we perceive each individual child. And I'd like to share with you a couple of thoughts from other educators that I think are completely meaningful for us in trying to understand how we can develop those social senses, the sense for language, the sense for thought, and particularly the sense of self, that we can perceive the individuality, what makes that child, that human being special. Janusz Korczak, the great Polish pedagogue, who created orphanages in Poland before the Second World War. He was Jewish, and there were orphanages for Jewish children. Talks about trying to understand 20 new children is comparable to trying to understand 20 different books, all written in languages one doesn't know very well. And the books are also damaged and have missing pages. He's talking here about trying to read a child, read what's inside a child. And he said, these are written in languages you don't understand very well. And the books also have missing pages. In other contexts, he says, learning to read a child is comparable to trying to read a book written in a foreign language, in which you have to try to understand an entire chapter from a few fragments of the text. And from the 20 sentences you do understand, 3 of them contradict each other. So you can see his wish, his struggle to understand, to perceive the self of that child and how difficult that is. We just have bits and pieces and we don't understand a lot. And Martin Buber, another great philosopher of the 20th century, he points out that it's not only that we're trying to read the children, but the children are trying to read us as well. He says that the art of teaching is that when the teacher learns how to discover, he discovers that each child in their own way is asking the same thing. And one has to just discover that way that child is asking. And what he says is, what they're all asking are, who are you? Do you know something which has to do with me? What are you bringing to me? What do you bring at all? And the art of teaching is to recognize that, is to see how the child is asking that. And for Rudolf Steiner, this was the primary task he saw in working with the teachers in the first Waldorf school. When Rudolf Steiner would come to Stuttgart every year for a couple of weeks and work with the teachers, and we have each year we have lectures for those, and we think, well, when Steiner was in Stuttgart, he gave these lectures, which he did. But what he did most of the day was child studies. the amount of child studies he did was enormous. My colleague Thomas Stragel did a history of the first Waldorf school. And so looking at the conference records, he came to the conclusion that Steiner did about 170 child studies in those couple of weeks he was there every year. And the child studies were his attempt to do that with the teachers, that they learned to see the individuality of the child. And of course, child studies are very intimate. We have no records of the children and what they said and what the teachers said about the child. But we do have an account from one of the teachers looking back on what it was like to do a child study with Rudolf Steiner. And it's very interesting because you might think, well, he's helping them to sort of see an aura, or see something supersensory perception. It wasn't that at all. I'd just like to read to you what Erich Schwebsch, one of the teachers of the first Waldorf school, wrote a few years after Steiner's death, looking back at what it was like to do a child study with Rudolf Steiner. For Rudolf Steiner, all that mattered was perceiving and grasping the individual presence of the spirit in every human being. Even in the smallest aspect, an entire being is present. And the educational task that Rudolf Steiner gave to us as teachers was to learn to recognize the presence of the spirit in those individual pupils that life had presented to us. He taught us to see the child, to have an artistic understanding and view of the gestalt, the rhythm, the colors, the intensity of all that expressed itself in and through the child's being and behavior. At those points that we were able to do this, it was like seeing for the first time. Through such experiences, which was a new way of knowing that freed us, pedagogical instincts were developed. Steiner didn't try to give us a pedagogical tradition, he simply opened our eyes. And this sense for self, the sense for being able to see what the spirit, how the spirit reveals itself in each individual child, I think will be the most threatened sense in an age that will be increasingly dominated by digitalization. If you look today at the way politicians, for instance, are speaking about the modernization of education, what has to be done, what the future of education is, you're going to be finding again and again, they say, well, digitalization, that's the way to go. The artificial intelligence, long articles in Germany's leading journal last week say, the way of the future will be artificial intelligence that will individually help each pupil to learn the way they need to learn. And what they're doing at this point is they're not actually looking at what just happened with COVID-19. Because when we look at what, that all those months and months of online learning, what we learned, there's a lot to be learned from that. And there's a lot of tragedy to be learned from that. And when we look at the rates of depression, the rates of suicide, the rates of unhappiness, how little was learned, it becomes very clear what the limits are of digital learning, of online learning. And it's not as you often read, at least in Germany, you read, the problem was that the teachers didn't work well with online teaching. I mean, we all learned to work with that as well as we could, and we all did our best, and it was certainly better than not doing anything. I want to make that clear. But there are limits. And when we talk about the sense for self, I think one of the limits will be that online, children don't feel they're being seen, and we actually can't really see them. We see them, but we don't see them. And they know that. And so, I mean, when we talk about what we can learn from these experiences we've had the last 2 years, I think we can really learn something about what happens when children become invisible. And in a certain sense, there were, of course, children who were truly invisible. They didn't have access to technology. They didn't have access to internet. And so they couldn't be seen at all. But I think that even those children who were on screen, who one could see, didn't have the feeling of being seen. They didn't have the feeling of being seen by their peers, by their friends, and by their teachers. And when we look at the incredible rates of depression, incredible unhappiness that we all know, was generated by this, and that's not only for children. This is on university age too. The statistics of university, what university students went through are, completely equivalent to what happened in schools. there's a lot to be learned from this, but I'm afraid that politicians are learning and drawing the long lessons. One of the, I think, most important books written in the last 10 years was by the Canadian educator Max von Manen, and I'll give you the source and what you'll be able to download at the end. Max von Manen developed this, he wrote this in 2015. He describes what he thinks is the most important pedagogical characteristic for our age. And he calls it something, he calls it pedagogical tact, which is a term that existed in the 19th century, but he understands it in a very special way. And I think in light of what we all went through in our experiences the last couple of years, what he's saying is extremely relevant. He says, we can say that pedagogical tact manifests itself in everyday life as instant action, forms a way of acting that is first of all dependent on an intuitive sensibility and sensitivity. In other words, a feeling understanding, is sensitive to the uniqueness of the child or young person, is sensitive to the particularities and context of the situation, and is unique also to the personal character of the teacher. This idea of pedagogical tact, and what I'd ask you to think about now is this possible online? He goes on to say, pedagogical tact does what it does by exercising a certain perceptive sensitivity, as well as practicing an active, expressive, and caring concern for the child. Pedagogical tact relies on our ability to see and hear, sense what the needs are of children, and also what the possibilities are of these children, or of any particular child. This means that pedagogical tact can only do its work when the eyes and ears are used for searching in a caring, open, and receptive manner what is the potential of a child, what this or that child can become. In other words, what is the essence or excellence of this child? I mean, a better description of Waldorf education I've never heard, really. I mean, written by somebody writing today, although he, as far as I know, he's nothing to do with Waldorf education. And he talks then about the pedagogical moment. He says, you know, the pedagogical moment, which I think we, you know, Steiner would say pedagogical intuition, is a pedagogical moment, is that moment where a teacher knows from perceiving what's happening, knows what's the right thing to do at that moment. And the question I'd like to ask is pedagogical tact or the pedagogical moment, is this really possible in online lessons? And I just am not convinced it is. And I'm convinced that you know, the little learning that took place, you know, the study in Germany where they compared the learning that happened in 2 months of the lockdown with learning in summer vacation. They discovered exactly the same thing. They learned as much in summer vacation as they did in 2 months of daily online lessons. I think this has a lot to do with the fact that those pedagogical moments, pedagogical tact, seeing the excellence of the child perceiving that he or she is being seen, is practically impossible online. And interesting enough, before the lockdown, Van Ma's book, we're talking about the invisibility of the children. Just like to read the last lines he writes. Children who do not have meaningful pedagogical contact with a caring adult are in reality invisible. Such a child is not seen. Ironically, it is exactly in this age of social media that children become invisible. They are invisible because the educational systems are only interested in learning outcomes, not the children themselves. And they are invisible because parents and their children are addictively distracted by their mobile devices. They become blind to their children's lives. So what can we offer? You know, we can't change the way society is going, or we can try to, but that's another issue. But I think we can offer children and young people and to their later lives a clear distinction, that they can make a clear distinction between the experience of the world through their senses and the experience of the world through a screen. And if they know that distinction, if they feel that distinction, if their senses led them to experience that distinction, then I think that they're protected in a way. Then I think that they can grow up to be healthy adults finding meaningful ways for their lives, that their excellence, what Manon calls excellence and their essential potentials can become realized if they understand that difference because they experience it. And this is, I think, we need to teach with this consciousness. And that's why I want to make the case for thinking about the senses in education, thinking about all the senses, thinking about our bodily senses, you know, if you're thinking about proprioception, how can we develop the sense of proprioception? Proprioception is so tied to our identity, tied to our feeling of being who we are, that we are the self making these movements. What would it mean if that sense was developed? You know, I mean, it's not that we want our children to become trapeze artists, who probably have the highest developed sense of proprioception, but anything they do that helps them develop that sense will be meaningful for the way they go through the world, the way they relate to their own bodies, and the way those bodies move in the world. The last thing I'd like to say has to do with one of my concerns. Along with the senses, what I'm concerned with is that in the next 10 or 20 years, when I try and look ahead and try and imagine, and I can only try to imagine, what's going to happen in the next 20 years. You think about climate change, you think about the different things that young people will be facing. I think there's a real danger of despair. And despair is something that obviously inhibits development in a profound way. What I'd like to look at is something that I think Joost also touched on last week when he talked about the importance in adolescence that they experience truth. And the truth, Steiner didn't mean, when Steiner talked about this quite on a number of occasions, he didn't mean truth, true or false. He meant truth in the sense of higher ideals. And Steiner made very clear that the development of idealism from the age of puberty on is the most important development that young people have to make. That if they have the chance to develop their idealism, it will give them something for their entire lives. And if they're faced with cynicism, if they're faced with despair, if they're faced with adults who don't take this idealism seriously, he says it's the most serious pedagogical mistake a teacher could ever make. He said, rather teach first grader purely intellectually than discourage the idealism of an adolescent. He says it doesn't matter if the ideals are realistic or unrealistic. He says what matters is a strength that develops in the young person because of that. So looking to the future, I think that this is something we really have to keep in mind because it's becoming increasingly difficult to be idealistic in some ways. And yet I think we have a lot to offer them that they couldn't possibly for themselves yet know. And that is that change and hope is incremental. It develops in steps. You know, young people are impatient and they should be impatient. But being impatient is not in itself wrong, but at the same time, they have to have a realization that change happens in steps, that it takes time, and there's so many examples in history where we can see how change happened invisibly. People developed invisibly, and it then suddenly happened, and people said, wow, it came out of nowhere, but it didn't come out of nowhere. It came because people had been pursuing their ideals, and we hadn't noticed. And I'd just like to give you one example. Black Lives Matter. You know, that Black Lives Matter was founded in 2013, basically unknown, and those people knew of it had a very negative idea of it. And the leaders of Black Lives Matter worked for years and years, basically invisible. Basically, you didn't hear much, and when you heard something, it was usually a negative. I think there's read a statistic that only 18% of Americans viewed Black Lives Matter positively in the first years of their existence. And then you see in 2020, when George Floyd was murdered, you see that up to 26 million people in the United States alone went to the streets and demonstrated and said Black Lives Matter. There were demonstrations all over the world that Black Lives Matter. And a young person could easily have the idea this started at that point, but it didn't. It had been going on for years. And it just took that time. And because those idealistic young people who believed in Black Lives Matter had been working the whole time, this took place. And I think that's the kind of message we need to give to young people, particularly from the age of puberty, that they realize that their ideals and what they're trying to develop and what they will hopefully be taking in the world through the richness of human senses, that this all takes time to have an effect. And, Martin Luther King knew that. And if you look at the biography of Martin Luther King and look at the development of the civil rights movement, it's very clear that although he's always trying to press forward, he also knows it's going to take time. And the important thing is not to let go, not to give up. And looking at his biography, I tried to figure out how he knew that. Because when he started, 1954 in Montgomery, Alabama, there was no way of predicting what was going to happen in the next 10 years, that the desegregation of the South, with all the problems that exist today compared to back then, that this was a completely different system. There were laws in every state, prohibiting Black people from doing things that white people could do. All this changed the civil rights movement, and he had the patience and the strength to carry this through until he died. And I found something that one of his teachers taught him, and one of his mentors is Benjamin Lane. I would like to end with a quotation, because you can see, Martin Luther King family was very important for him, and his teachers. And one of his teachers said, as Benjamin Mays, he was a mentor to Martin Luther King in college, "The tragedy of life doesn't lie in not reaching your goal. The tragedy lies in having no goal to reach. It isn't a calamity to die with dreams unfilled, but it's a calamity not to dream. It is not a disgrace not to reach the stars, but it is a disgrace to have no stars to reach for. Not failure, but low aim is a sin." So I just like that we help young people to fully connect to those high aims, that we let them, that we believe in them and believe in their high aims and do what we can to give them what they'll need to grow up in a world that's very different than the world we grew up in. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. So, right now I would like, before we go into the questions and have a bit of an exchange, I would like to ask Laura just to show us the certificate of participation, which you can download then, so that just all of you can see it for once.
Yeah, exactly. So here you will see, well, this is how it looks like. We will now also insert the link into the chat, of course, and here you are able to write your name, and this also displays at which lecture you've participated, and with the official signature by Joseph. And yeah, we hope that with this you can trace back in a few years at which lectures you were actually participating.
Thank you so much, Laura. So now there are a couple of questions already in. Just a moment. There is one question by Da Silva relating to online schooling or homeschooling as it is in the online situation we have. And the question is, isn't the real problem that social distance by using electronic devices and therefore the lacking of our most crucial urge of socializing, closeness that can be felt and experienced?
Yeah, basically there's so much to be learned from what everyone went through with online learning. And the idea, as I mentioned, that somehow the fault was that one didn't know how to do this well, ignores the reality that young people, really of all ages, need to be with their peers, they need to be with their teachers. And online is our attempt to try to be with them. And as I say, I taught online, as I'm sure everyone did, and one tries to do one's best, but it's not the same, and it will never be the same. And particularly for young people, and by young people, I'm talking about first graders, but I'm also talking about college students, and I'm sure those of you who are college students have something to say about that too. There's something fundamental missing. And as long as we understand that, then I think online teaching is what we needed to do. And it's good we did it. But what matters to me is that people realize the differences and realize that the future of education doesn't lie in digitalization. At least in Germany, when you talk about the modernization of education, you hear right away that the modernization is the digitalization of education. Modernization is using artificial intelligence. And this is not the modernization of education, as far as I'm concerned. Modernization of education would be, for instance, to recognize in a world in which digital technology is so predominant, and that's the way it is. And it's got huge advantages, we know that. It becomes, to modernize education means exactly to develop our senses in a way that we experience the difference between virtual reality and the reality of the world, and the reality of other people.
Thank you, Peter. And there's another question by Da Silva. It's concerning the Black Lives Matter movement. Don't you think it got pushed by social media in general, thus pushed through electronic devices? If they don't use the Floyd case, it would have never got as big as it got to this point in time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm not against social media. And you just gave a great example, of how social media made something possible. If it wasn't filmed on a mobile device, if it wasn't sent to the world, if it wasn't, uploaded, all over the world, this wouldn't have happened. So obviously, there's huge advantages, and we can be glad about that. But just as, at different times, things had to be visible, things had to be public to be able to take action. The question is only, what role does it have for us as teachers in education? And this is a question I think that needs to be looked at critically, and needs to be looked at sensitively. And if we take the ideals that, for instance, Max von Mann talks about, pedagogical tact, seeing the excellence of every child, learning to see the individuality of every child, or Rudolf Steiner talking about seeing the spirit in every child, I think that being online and social media don't allow for that kind of contact. And I think, that there's this interesting research documenting that the more young people use social media, the more use, each person has, the more depressed and lonely they become. It doesn't seem to solve the questions of loneliness to be on social media. And, there's a book by Jean Tweng, Tweng, called The I Generation, which is really just a book basically documenting the effects of what the effects of what it means to spend huge amounts of time on social media, and it's basically something that doesn't contribute to young people's development. So in social media, and one can love the possibilities we have with it, but I think we just have to see what the limits are as well.
Okay, thank you. There's a next question by Helen Kinsey. How do we reconcile the idealism in the young of gender equality when it involves taking hormones and changing the physical body?
Okay, thank you. That is a very important question. I don't consider that idealism. What's the difference? The idea of having to change one's body, and I'm not talking about gender change. I'm talking about, young women, for instance, who feel they have to have an operation to become more beautiful. This is the kind of what I'm talking about. Have an image of the way they should look that has been generated by what they've seen, and then take hormones or do this. I'm referring to that. I would definitely say that this is not idealism. This is actually being shaped by images and by social media, or by media in general, which is, if anything, distracting them and taking the place of their excellence, their what makes them special, what makes them, where their potentials in life lie, which certainly don't lie in having their nose operated on, or having or all the different things that happen when people have an idealized vision of what beauty is, and are willing to do all sorts of things themselves to reach that. So I think those are examples of people, or young people, who need support for developing something else within them. I'm not sure if that's the way you meant the question. If you're talking about gender change, that would be a different question.
I was talking about gender change, yeah.
Change. Okay. Yeah, I don't know if there's a general answer to that question. You know, I think, and I also can't say that I have much experience with this question, you know, in being asked by young people and children. What I do think is that it can only be dealt with individually, you know, and individually in the sense of trying to really listen to young people and try to understand what's going on. But, you know, we're in an area where I don't have any personal experience with that. So I want to be careful about anything that I say, other than that I'm convinced that it's always going to be different from one to another. I'm sorry, I can't help you more with that question, because, you know, in what sense that's idealism? I really don't know. And one thing maybe I know is that it's not going to be the same for everyone. It's going to be different.
There's a question by Joy de Berker. How do we open parents to the dangers of digitalization, especially when it is the way the world is moving, despite neuroscience and educationalists' warning?
Yeah, this is a question we're all facing. And I think it requires, you know, it requires a lot of pedagogical tact with parents. You know, I was very struck with Ida's response to the question when she was asked about how she introduces Waldorf education to the parents. You know, how she gets them to understand some of the principles. And if you remember what she said, the first thing she does is she listens to the parents. She sees her work with the parents as being first and foremost listening to the parents. And I thought that is a wonderful example of a social sense. And it's also a wonderful example of how change can happen. Because if you're really listening to the parents, then I think you'll have a sense of how, if parents feel they're listened to, then you'll have a sense of how to talk about the problems, how to talk about, you know, an excessive digital usage in early childhood is a problem. Excessive digital usage, even, you know, in adolescence is a problem. But if you go and just tell the parents that, and parents don't feel they're listened to, it's not going to go very far. So, you know, something I also learned from Christoph Wiechert, who, you know, years ago managed to change a lot of people's thinking about the work with parents, in Germany at least, by saying, you know, the parents have to be seen as the experts for their children, and the teachers have to be seen as the experts for teaching. You know, and when parents tell teachers how to teach, they're going past their expertise. And when teachers tell parents how to be parents, they're also going past their right to do that. You know, it's not the way we can treat parents. That's why the parents have come together with that child for reasons that we can only guess, you know. So I think the idea of trying to get parents to understand things, or trying to help parents understand things, can only begin, and I thought Ida made this, was a beautiful example, by listening to them and then opening up the conversation. And I think at that point, then we have a sense as teachers of the pedagogical moment of where we can maybe say something about some of the dangers, some of the problems. But I can almost imagine, I mean, you know, in my experience, when you talk to parents and they talk about the way they see their children in digital media, you know, the effects of that, they've often realized stuff too, and they just haven't been asked that question. So in that sense, you know, I would encourage you to take Ida's example and Christoph's example here, two of the people who lectured before, in terms of the way we try and approach working with parents.
Thank you. There is a recommendation by Douglas in the chat. There's a book by Michaela Glöckler, Growing Up Healthy in a World of Digital Media. So yeah, Douglas is showing it. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Douglas. There's a question by Clarambre Ibarola. I work in kindergarten, and I have noticed a lot of young children needing attention from us. We also assume that the parents don't have much time for them, for example, work or cell phones, etc. How do we help them? How should we talk to the parents about this case?
Yeah, again, you know, I think it's the question, the only way I can imagine being constructive as a teacher is to go into dialogues with parents with great respect and wishing to listen, you know. And when, you know, we know that from ourselves too, when we feel respected, when we feel that we're being listened to, We open up to new ideas in very different ways, and if we feel we're being preached at. And Waldorf education has an unfortunate tradition of preaching. We sort of know the answer. The teacher is the expert, and the artist is a teacher, and we have the right to tell parents how to be parents. We don't. And I thought when Christoph, this is the 1990s, was going around German schools and making clear that the parents have to be treated as the experts for their children. There were a lot of teachers, who've been doing very different things than that. And I still remember in my school, when he said that, a whole auditorium turned around and looked at a few teachers who were sitting in the auditorium as well, had they gotten the message, because they had been preached at, a lot. So I think in that sense, with that kind of respect and with that kind of, acceptance of the situation, then it's actually possible to enter into dialogue and point things out that maybe the parents in some ways have even realized, but hasn't really ever been talked about. And there is obviously a lot of research, a lot of things that one can bring in, so it doesn't sound like just Waldorf education, these old-fashioned Waldorf people. In these situations, I like to bring in what neurologists say, what psychologists say, to make clear that this is not our thing. This is something that concerns a lot of people outside of Waldorf as well. But again, it's a question of timing. It's a question of listening first and seeing, is this appropriate? It's not just as like teaching, it's the same thing.
There's Georgi Banar. As a teacher, how do you help your students when it comes to develop their senses of truth and ideals? Especially, you don't pass on your own ideals. And he says, I'm looking for some examples.
Yeah. I think that's a great question. I think it's really practical too. There are fantastic examples of whether it's, I mentioned Martin Luther King, the Civil Rights Movement. If you study what happened in that movement, the setbacks they had, and how they responded, what it meant to meet hate and violence with nonviolence. And of course, he had learned that from Gandhi, who was doing the same thing. And, when young people hear about, or Nelson Mandela, when apartheid ended in South Africa, they placed bets on the chances of this being a peaceful transition of power, and there not being, hateful reactions and revenge taken. And the bets were, everybody thought, terrible things were going to happen, and they didn't. It was an amazing transition. And it was an amazing transition because Nelson Mandela was so clear about what shouldn't be the case, that there should be no revenge, that there had to be a living together. And so, Václav Havel, the Europeans will probably be familiar with him, who became president of the Czech Republic. Until he was the president, he was in jail, for years in jail, just because he was a dissident, because he was protesting, because he was writing critical things. And he writes about hope. While in jail, the letters he smuggled out, he writes about hope. And he says, it doesn't matter if, the hope will be realized. What matters is that the hope is good, that the hope is true. He says, and because it's good and because it's true, that's why he has it. And it's not because he thinks it's going to succeed, but because in itself it has that value. And astonishingly, within the space of a few weeks, he became the president of the Czech Republic. He went from jail to the presidency in 1989. And so these things happen, and so, you look at a biography like that, and, Mandela and Gandhi, there's so many examples that I think for young people can be very powerful. And one has to choose the right time, of course, and one has to go into it oneself. But I think that those can be life-changing for young people, because it speaks to something in them that they carry within themselves. When they see what Mandela, spent how many decades in prison, Martin Luther King, Václav Havel, people like this, they see what's possible. And I think at that point, something's touched in them, something resonates in them that will help them realize their own ideals. And it's not necessarily your ideals as a teacher, it's the idea of something larger than ourselves.
Thank you, Peter. There is Daniel Woolley. He asks, could you share a few thoughts about the transformation of sensory perception, 12 senses, into the insightful perception you described as pedagogical tact or intuition?
Yeah, thank you. That's a wonderful question. I'm always brought back to child studies, with a question like that, because a child study is, it gives a structure where we get past our everyday selves, where we're together with our colleagues, and a child who's not physically in the room is very much still in the room, through the descriptions and the attention being paid. And at that point, I have the feeling everybody's senses, and particularly their higher sense, and particularly the sense for self, are being developed because everybody's straining together to try and understand a difficult child. And at that moment, two things are happening. Each person in themselves is becoming at that moment different than they are in their everyday lives. I mean, the same colleague who you might just had a huge fight with, or you don't even like, or you think, that you wish the colleague wasn't even at your school, in a child study becomes different. That's been my experience. That really, it brings out the best in people, and one's doing it together. So my experience always was, as an English teacher or a music teacher, I had a very limited view of children, and I had a perspective on a difficult child, shaped by the fact that they didn't do their homework in English for, 2 years, and then the sports teacher would talk about how they were in sports. So the, teacher for handicrafts would talk about how they were in handicrafts, and I had a completely different picture of the child, which I had never had the acuity of vision. I had never had the perception to be able to see that was the same person. And so, at that point, you go back into the classroom and you go and you see that child, you see him completely differently, or you see her completely differently. And already, you've made a step, you've made a step in developing your sense for self, because it was all there. You just didn't see it. So I think we need each other for that. And I think we need to create space where we can realize those potentials in ourselves. And I think child studies are really a remarkable way of doing that, as one example.
Okay. So there's a question by Niels Schiemann. I see you there with your cat. Maybe you can put your question yourself.
The cat enjoys the lecture very much. So, Peter, I want to put up a somewhat different perspective. I wrote that I guess the digitalization of education is not the same as online education. It can and will come in different forms, I suppose. And one of them is that there's actually quite some people working right now on artificial intelligence that will help to make the learning or the didactics more effective if it's about automatization, for example, or learning rules like grammar rules. And I'm quite sure that this is something that's going to proceed, if we like it or not. Mm-hmm. What I'm wondering is, how can we not just fight it, but incorporate it in a healthy way? Because I think I see possibilities there, but I'm wondering, what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I agree with you, whether we like it or not, this is what's going to happen. So, I mean, it really, you put it very clearly. How do we deal with this? What approach do we take? Again, I think what's really important, what we do in a classroom is always going to be different than what young people do at home. And I think if in classrooms, we make use of the fact that a direct human interaction is taking place, and I'll take an example of foreign language teaching, that the experience of speaking and listening to or acting in a foreign language in a space together is radically different than working with digital technology and a learning program. If pupils at home, if you say that this is an interesting program, and if you want to do this outside of class, this might help you with this, it might help you with that, and you discover something that might be helpful. You can't keep it from doing it anyway, so why don't you just sort of point it out, that it exists? And then it's probably better than a lot of other things they do online. So in that sense, I wouldn't, obviously age appropriate. I'm not going to be saying that to third graders, but you know, certainly from 12, 13 years on, I mean, it's clear that could be a help. I mean, as a foreign language teacher, I'm doubtful that it will be a huge help, but I also think it could be a help. You know, the problem I see is that the incorporation of digital technology into teaching directly, taking the place of what's possible with interaction between people. You know, because again, if that's experience, you know, children experience or young people experience, you know, what it's like to act out a role in a foreign language, you know, if you do a drama exercise, something like that. The experience of that is a complete physical soul experience. You know, it enters into their bodies. Working with artificial intelligence on digital technology doesn't enter into their bodies in any comparable way. And foreign language learning, just as an example, it's my field, is very much about taking something into your body, you know, becoming part of you. And so I think digital technology will tend to very much emphasize the cognitive, which is important too, but it's limited. So, you know, my answer to you would be, you know, when it's age appropriate to you know, possibly inform people of that, you know, if there are things you can recommend, say it's something that you could work on, see what experiences they have, you know, and it'd be interesting actually to ask, you know, people to do that and then talk about it, you know, what have they learned from it, like that. But it's when they don't have the chance in lessons to experience language as a whole, foreign language teaching, but the same, you know, I think would be true for the math teacher, the same would be true for history teacher. That's the problem. So the modernization of education is, for me, not digitalization in the sense that in classrooms, this won't be an answer to the needs of the future. What young people then choose to do on their own is obviously something that you know, we can only hope and encourage them to do it in a constructive way, like that. I don't know if that's an answer, but I mean, that's just the distinction I want to make between our interaction with the pupils, the value of that, the importance of that, the importance of them interacting physically in the same space in comparison to working with a digital gadget. And at the same time, say the digital gadget may be for some pupils very helpful. You know, I don't know that, but I certainly would say encourage someone who wants to do that, try it. You know, I'm not in third grade, but yeah, thank you for the question. They have a beautiful cat.
And then there's a question by Guna. Maybe you can put it yourself. Are you here? Can you put on your speaker, Guna?
Yeah, hi.
Hey.
Yo, hi. This is a really lovely presentation. Thank you. Just that the more I'm getting interacting with Steiner's ideas, I realized that he talked about the senses, the individual spirit. But then I felt I'm feeling that when you mentioned social media, how it's taking that away. But I feel that it's very effective because it rewards this personality and individual interest. So my question is, does Steiner also should it be better? I mean, not better, as in, would it be a better way to look at it as a person, part of the community, instead of looking at them individually? Is that clear? I'm not too sure. Can't see myself.
Can you run it by me again? I'm trying to get it, but I don't want to get the wrong question. Can you run that
because
again?
because in your handout you keep you talk about the individual's interests.
Yeah.
That means that Steiner should be emphasized on, and that's why you need to cater to Steiner education.
Right.
But I feel that there can be not a slippery slope. It's very it's something that the social media and digitization does very well, and that's why people are attracted to it. So should we look at it from another point of view? I'm not being Marxist, but from a community point of view. I mean, should it be more effect that it's okay to be invisibilized in a community? That means you don't see your individual interest, but you see yourself as part of a bigger community.
Okay. I wonder whether that has to be, you know, either this or that. I mean, I think I see what you're saying, and it seems to me, you know, it's exactly something that's not digital, either, you know, black or white, or, you know, I mean, I think, you know, we had that example before, Black Lives Matter, what social, you know, the tremendous role social media played, or, you know, Arab Spring, you know, I mean, social media has done, you know, wonderful things in terms of creating community over borders, like that. In that sense, those are the advantages. Those are the things that are made possible.
Yes.
And, and certainly from a certain age on, I would encourage people, to be active in these kinds of movements, and whether it's Amnesty International, whether it's Doctors Without Borders, the online would be the connection for most people, if they're not living in a place where these organizations take place. And you can't, so, I mean, those are wonderful possibilities. My only fear would be that many young people, because they're going through difficult phases in their lives, aren't looking for that, but it ends up being sort of, what we talked about before, their own image of their own body, or what they should look like, I mean, so I think it's really important, and I think that's the way I understand you, to make a distinction where social media becomes really an instrument for something very positive, and where it can also become an instrument for something destructive, and it can, and I say it can lead to isolation, strangely enough. When people when their only friends, in quotation marks, are in Facebook, they're isolated, and the psychologists, make pretty clear that the young people who are on Facebook 6 hours a day are much unhappier than the young people who are on Facebook 1 hour a day. I mean, so I think it's a matter of differentiating how they're using social media, and the examples that we've just been talking about, as positive examples of what social media was able to do, are examples, I think, when they're in the classroom, maybe give young people a chance to see, okay, these are the possibilities, am I taking advantage of them? am I aware of this? Or am I spending my time, watching stuff on the internet that isn't doing anything good for the community? I mean, what a great question to ask, is being part of a community something that's helpful for the world? And many communities, one can only be online, or is being online something that I'm doing and it's doing nobody any good, neither me nor anybody else, and if young people have that distinction, then then I think we've done a good job, and they've done a good job like that. Thank you for the question.
So Douglas, you have seen a car bumper sticker. Do you want to comment on that?
Just to say the obvious, that in many cases, Waldorf education is education by the back door, by which I mean that it comes in at the opposite end to achieve its result. And whereas most people, I think, possibly even people are participating in a format like this one, they expect to learn by listening, that you may discover, especially if you have conversation, that you learn by speaking. And the real learning or the real teaching comes from the person who listens actively. That was the point of the bumper sticker.
Yeah. Thank you, Douglas. That kind of active listening is something that, that I would bring that back to the discussion of how to work with parents, but also how to teach, as you know, that what a difference that makes when people are actively listened to what they have to say, there's this one of the great American psychologists of the 20th century, Carl Rogers, I know you're familiar with, but I don't know if everybody in other cultures are familiar with. He had a form of therapy that was based on what he called deep listening. And he was convinced that people could only his patients could only solve their own problems, that he couldn't solve as a therapist, as a psychoanalyst, he couldn't solve their problems. They had to solve their problems themselves. The only thing he could do was to listen so deeply and so intensively that they would come to the realizations they needed to come to. That they would, as you said, they would speak out that what they need to do. And so his therapy was based on this concept of the therapist learning to so deeply listen that it created that possibility for the patient. And that's always been to me sort of an example of what, a highly developed sense of listening, of understanding the language, thought, and self of another, and letting that self then express itself in what it needs to do. And I'm trying to put that in the chat there for those of you who are not familiar with Carl Rogers' work. It's very exciting and very, I think as teachers, we can learn a lot from that.
Thank you. There is a question by Christoph concerning age appropriate in teaching. Christoph, can you put it yourself?
Okay, I'll try it again. The issue of age appropriate and versus this idea of social census. When I'm thinking about it, when I'm reflecting upon that, I sort of get the idea that the only guideline here, the only guide here is my intuition, the way to meet the student, the pupil, to see another human being is to go deeply into the sphere that is locked in the classroom environment because of social customs, because of social boundaries that we set for our safety and security. So the meeting with another, the meeting I think you have in mind here means sets a difficulty for me here. Sets a difficulty of how to approach it, of how to set that, how to find that appropriateness. And I'm not sure whether I'm making this clear, but I just thought that maybe this could be a sort of a way of inspiring you to say a little more about that.
Thank you, Christoph. I think that's an important question. I think in some ways it lies at the heart of what Steiner was trying to do when he introduced Waldorf education through his emphasis on pedagogical anthropology. And there's for instance, the book "The Foundations of Human Experience" or the Study of Man. His understanding of development and growth, and at what age, what parts of the human being need to be most supported. And of course, there's always individual variations, and it's certainly not, at the age of 7, this happens, the age of 14, this happens. That's not what it's meant at all. But a sense for what needs to be developed, in kindergarten age. What is age appropriate in kindergarten? And if you watch children playing, as imaginatively, as freely as they're doing, and as seriously, children play seriously. You have to think, this is healthy. This is what they need to do. And the same children, that you then sit down in your chair, and I want to teach you how to read, and they're 5 years old, it doesn't feel right. And I've talked to kindergarten teachers, in countries where that's required, that that the 5-year-olds are learning to read and write and learning to work with numbers. And they say they feel terrible because they see the children playing outside and realize this is what they need to do. All the discoveries they make, and what's difficult with the other kids, and all these things that happen. So age appropriate, I think, Steiner's pedagogical anthropology can be a real help, because he really looks at it from a very encompassing perspective, which I think is still in many cases still very valid today. Something like puberty happens earlier now. So again, it's always and it happens also differently in different cultures and different individualities. And yet there are, I think, general things that can be learned. And for myself, learn, as you say, there's a certain intuition you need. This is what this young person needs at this age. But it can be very helpful to have a larger picture of what that development to that age is. And of course, Steiner has no monopoly on that. There's other people who've written very perceptively about different ages and what's necessary there. But I would say, for myself and for my students, I feel that Steiner's pedagogical anthropology can be a real help in thinking about what's necessary at a certain age.
Thank you.
Yes, last question, Christoph, because we have reached the end of the time.
No, I just wanted to thank.
Okay.
Thanks for the answer.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Peter. That was really a wonderful lecture, and you gave us a very broad perspective, I think, and the feeling that I think all good thoughts of pedagogy are connected. So that was a wonderful lecture. Thank you so much. And I have, Laura has put the email address of Peter in the chat. So if you have further questions or want to have an exchange, you can contact him. And next week, we will hear a talk by Ruhi Thyssen from Sweden. And he's a crafts teacher, and he did a dissertation about craft work at Waldorf schools. And the topic is the importance of the crafts in Waldorf pedagogy. So I wish you a happy World Teachers' Day, and looking forward to meet you again next week. Goodbye.